popular myth claims a medieval sword cost the equivalent of a modern sports car or a house. It is a persistent narrative that suggests only kings and lords could afford basic weapons, but the historical record tells a different story. By the 14th century, swords were manufactured on a near-industrial scale in cities like Milan, Solingen, and London. If every sword required a king's ransom, the 100 Years' War would have bankrupted Europe before the first battle was fought. The real question is not how much gold a sword cost, but how many days of sweat a common laborer had to trade for one. Let us look at the actual account books and wage statutes. The raw material itself was not the primary expense. Iron was ubiquitous across medieval Europe, smelted in bloomeries from bog ore and mined hematite. By the late medieval period, a hundredweight of raw bar iron cost roughly 5 shillings in England. A finished arming sword weighed between 1.5 and 2.5 pounds. The metal required to forge a blade represented only a fraction of a shilling in raw material. If the iron was cheap, the expense had to lie elsewhere in the supply chain. The cost was not in the dirt, but in the fire and the hammer. Refining that cheap iron into usable steel required a staggering amount of fuel. To produce a single pound of refined bar iron, a bloomery furnace consumed up to 20 pounds of charcoal. Charcoal burning was a dedicated industry, managed by colliers who harvested entire forests to feed the forges. Before the blacksmith even touched the metal, a vast network of woodcutters and colliers had already invested days of labor into the raw material. This hidden labor cost is where the true expense of the blade begins to accumulate. But how did this translate to the price at the smithy? In the year 1351, the Statute of Laborers fixed the wages of a mastersmith in England. A mastersmith could charge 4 pence per day, plus his meals. An ordinary agricultural laborer at the same time earned roughly 1.5 pence per day. A standard infantry sword from a London armory in the late 14th century cost roughly 16 pence. For the laborer, that equates to about 11 days of work. For the mastersmith, forging the blade might take 2 or 3 days. The profit margin was real, but it was not extortionate. So what happened when the blade needed finishing? A sword was rarely made by a single craftsman. The medieval arms industry was strictly compartmentalized by guild regulations. A bladesmith forged the raw shape, but a grinder refined the edge on water-powered stones. A polisher finished the surface, and a cutler mounted the blade into its hilt. Each of these specialists charged for their specific labor, adding layers of cost to the final product. This division of labor ensured quality control but multiplied the wages involved. Yet, even with multiple skilled tradesmen, the basic sword remained affordable. What else drove up the price? Blade was only half the weapon. A sword required a scabbard to protect the blade and the wearer. Scabbards were complex constructions of wooden cores, leather wrapping, and metal shapes. A high-quality scabbard could easily cost as much as the blade itself. Furthermore, the hilt required wooden grips bound in wire or leather, and a pommel to balance the weapon. These fittings often used brass, bronze, or even antler. The expense of a sword was essentially doubled by the accessories required to make it functional. Could a soldier afford this complete package? Documentary evidence from the 14th century proves that common soldiers were routinely armed with swords. Royal provisioning accounts from England show thousands of swords purchased for garrison troops at bulk rates. In 1344, the Exchequer paid just under 2 shillings per sword for the garrison at Caernarfon. This was a mass-produced weapon, functional but plain, lacking decoration. A common foot soldier could expect to be issued one, or buy one for a few weeks' wages. It was a tool of the trade, not a wealthy heirloom. But what about the knights and nobility? Aristocracy demanded weapons that signaled status, which radically altered the economic equation. A knightly sword might feature a blade of imported Spanish steel, inlaid with silver or gold lettering. The hilt could be wrapped in shark skin, and the pommel might be gilded or set with precious stones. In 1396, a sword made for the future King Henry Roman IV cost over 12 pounds. That is roughly 900 days of a laborer's wages. The cost of a luxury sword lay entirely in the materials and the ego of the buyer. But what happened when the fighting was over? The purchase price was only the initial investment. Swords broke, chipped, and rusted, requiring constant upkeep. A blade that struck armor or another blade developed nicks that required a grinder's attention. The organic materials of the scabbard and grip rotted or wore away from sweat and weather. Records from the Tower of London show constant payments to smiths for mending swords and replacing broken scabbards. Owning a sword meant paying a continuous tax of maintenance. How did soldiers manage this ongoing expense? Because swords held a stable, recognized value, they functioned as a form of liquid capital. Medieval probate inventories frequently list swords alongside debts and owed wages. Men pawned their swords to local merchants or monasteries to secure immediate cash. A soldier might sell his sword to fund a journey home or trade it for a horse. The weapon was a commodity that could be liquidated in a crisis. It was an asset, but its value fluctuated based on condition and fashion. What was the ultimate factor in a sword's worth? By the late medieval period, the cost of a sword was increasingly defined by law rather than economics. Sumptuary laws in several European cities restricted who could carry a sword in public. In some jurisdictions, carrying a sword required a license or proof of gentle birth. This artificial scarcity created a secondary cost, the social and legal risk of bearing arms without permission. The price of the steel was irrelevant if the local magistrate confiscated the weapon. The sword had become a symbol of class, legally protected from the lower classes. Did this drive the prices even higher? In times of extended peace, the market for swords collapsed. Guilds in Solingen and Toledo faced economic ruin when standing armies were not actively campaigning. To survive, swordsmiths pivoted to making agricultural tools, knives, and domestic cutlery. The specialized infrastructure of sword production could not sustain itself without the steady drumbeat of war. The sword's economic value was entirely dependent on the political climate. When the wars ended, the weapons became surplus, sold at a fraction of their wartime cost. How does this change our final calculation? Let's calculate the definitive cost in days of work. A standard infantry sword in the 14th century cost roughly 16 pence. A laborer earning 1.5 pence per day needed to work 11 days to afford the blade alone. Adding the scabbard and hilt brings the total to roughly 3 weeks of labor. That is a significant investment, comparable to buying a modern laptop, not a luxury car. The sword was expensive, but entirely accessible to the working class. It was an expense that required saving, not a lifetime of servitude. The myth of the priceless sword ignores the reality of medieval mass production. A sword cost an ordinary worker about 3 weeks of wages for a functional weapon, and significantly more for decorated luxury. The real expenses lay in the charcoal, the specialized labor, and the necessary accessories. It was a tool of violence, a liquid asset, and a status symbol, all rolled into 2 pounds of steel. The historical record leaves no room for romantic exaggeration. You can download the primary sources and wage calculations used in this analysis for free at Gilds & Grains.